Howdy, howdy. Welcome back to my tiny corner of the internet. So in today's video, I kind of want to respond to a video by Hank Green, where he has an absolute meltdown about how AI data centers are sucking up all the electricity in the United States, and that demand's going to far exceed supply, and that we just can't build more. And so the gist of the video is that without Republicans supporting and subsidizing, green energy, I mean, what he means by green energy is, of course, solar and wind, which I'm not the biggest supporter of, and I'll tell you why, is that, demand is going to far outpace supply. And he says that essentially you're just going to have a tiny group of capitalists who are going to take advantage of the profitable industry and the rising prices of electricity to once again do what I've talked about on this channel plenty of times, is, engage in rent-seeking behavior, not actually increase the supply of things, but just, nerf it to enough degree so prices go up and they can make extra money off the increased demand. And thus far, over the last 4 years, electricity prices have absolutely skyrocketed. If it weren't for the fact that technology has gotten more efficient where you need less electricity, man, people would be hurting. Imagine if your houses still used incandescent light bulbs today when electricity prices have skyrocketed instead of LEDs, or using less efficient technology or things that were more power sucking. And the funny part is that this is all artificial. It is 100% artificial. And as you know, your boy Alistair loves to talk about science and technology. It's his background. I have a huge background in physics and engineering, and that's something I love to talk about a lot, not just on this channel, but in real life. If you ever to strike up a conversation with me, I love talking about technology. And so whenever somebody talks about energy, I love to go in the science of it. I love talking about the numbers of that sorts of stuff, is because the fact is, I think a lot of people ignore the numbers and they just love to talk about speculative things. They love to talk about, labels. They love to call things green when they're not green. And a fun fact about green energy supplies is that, like, a lot of the times they'll mislabel stuff like, different forms of coal is like green when they're actually not. They still emit carbon dioxide. And so I actually classify fuels a little bit differently. And this kind of offends the sensibilities of some people, but I see organic fuels as anything that is, organic. It's carbon, okay? And when you burn it, it emits carbon dioxide. And so one of the true energy sources that I really love that do not emit any carbon dioxide, and I'm the biggest shill for it, but the thing is you will not get many green activists to support it, is nuclear fission power. And the funny part is, as of right now, the United States gets 20% of its electricity from nuclear fission power. Fission is where you split the atom to generate energy. It's distinctly different from fusion, which you basically, merge atoms together and get energy from it. So like a fusion bomb is something that's like a hydrogen bomb. It relies on the fusion of hydrogen atoms into helium to produce extraneous energy. Fission is when you split atoms like uranium-235 or plutonium-239, or even thorium. I forget which isotope that is. That my background obviously isn't like nuclear physics. I have a general understanding in physics. But, it might be thorium-238. I could be incredibly wrong on that one for that isotope, right? But you split those atoms to generate heat energy as well. Okay, and so I want to go into a little bit of a background of energy, okay? And I'm a big thermodynamics shill. In fact, one of the biggest things is that if I were ever in a position of political power for anybody to dictate any type of civilizational policy, the first class I would force everybody to take is a thermodynamics class, okay? The zeroth law of thermodynamics isn't really relevant, is because that's more or less an equilibrium law about temperatures between bodies. First is the conservation of energy. Second is the rise of entropy and the energy. The first law of thermodynamics is about the conservation of energy. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed. Okay, that's the first law of thermodynamics. And the second law of thermodynamics, which everyone is very familiar with, it's almost popularized in media, is that that entropy always rises. You have a degradation of forms of energy. And the third one more or less just has to go with the change in entropy being constant when you approach absolute zero. And that's an empirical law as well that I'm not going to get too terribly much into in this video. But the first and the second one I would say are the most relevant. The zeroth law is more relating to temperatures and equilibrium points. But I want to talk about the first and second law of thermodynamics. When you understand those talking points, then I will take your opinion more seriously on what energy policy you may or may not have. And sure, that sounds elitist, but wouldn't you want the best doctor to cure you for your cancer? Wouldn't you want the best and most meritocratic doctor to save your dying child, right? You have a hierarchy of needs on who you want to be helping you out. So why is it any different with climate change? If it's such an emergency for all of civilization, wouldn't you want the best people to be giving you the solution towards your problem? And so, yes, I'm elitist about this sort of stuff. Not everybody's opinions are equal, and I think some people's opinions are better than others. That's just my natural way of thinking. I mean, I still have a selling way to do this for conservatives if they have a point on what I think, this benefit this is to them, even if you just neglect climate change. I can make that argument too, but, I'm more or less speaking to more or less the people who are, concerned about climate change, that, simultaneously hold a set of values, but they want solutions to problems, and then they don't like the solutions of the problems when there's not really anything else in that thing. And so I always like to talk about energy and entropy, because those are my favorite things to talk about, is because I don't think you can avoid it in any discussion related to climate change. Is because the interesting thing is that when you talk about energy, I'm going to go ahead and drop this fact of reality. Every living being requires extraneous energy to propagate its own material existence. Okay, you as a human being requires 2,000 calories a day, 2,000 kilocalories. Okay, and big calories, if you want to call it that. And you need that to reproduce your own material existence. Every living creature on this planet has to reproduce its material existence through the extraction and the exploitation of free energy freely provided by nature. And if it doesn't, it perishes. As it falls out of existence, it dies. Okay, that's a fact of life. Okay, every living material being has to do this to reproduce its own material existence, or it perishes. And civilization. I always like to talk about civilization is because you can think of civilization as a giant living organism as well, that if it does not actually get what it needs to propagate its own existence, and, obviously a society, human society, is no different, okay? If that society is not able to collectively work to reproduce its own material existence and cannot get the extraneous energy needed to reproduce in its own existence, it's going to perish, okay? And it goes down to the fact is you have to spend a portion of your physical energy to acquire the means of subsistence. Every living being individually and collectively has to do this. You have to work to live, or at least you've had to work to live for the last 12,000 years, and prior to that, especially when you lived in pre-agricultural societies, you had to expend a certain amount of energy to get a certain amount of energy back, and that energy that you got in return always has to be more than what you spent. Okay? Because this all, once again, goes down to thermodynamics. Not all energy is perfect. In fact, there's always, at every conversion of energy, some of it is lost to heat and it becomes useless. You cannot turn pure heat into any other form of energy. It's a wasted form of energy. It's useless. Okay? And the funny part about that wasted energy, and how I know this fact, is that if you were to ever try to design a steam engine, because the early designers of steam engines in the Industrial Revolution tried to create heat engines that could convert pure heat into mechanical work. That was a big question. They wondered if it was possible. And I don't want to go into the math. I don't want to talk about thermodynamic theory too deeply, but that answer turns out to be no. It is a useless form of energy, and the only time you can use heat in a mechanical work, which is what a steam engine is, or a heat engine, is when you have it in proximity to a colder reservoir where you can have heat flow that generates mechanical work. Okay? And so the funny part is a little bit of a side note, because now we're going into the topic of steam engines and, societal reproduction and energy, is that a lot of people are talking about we're going to reindustrialize, the United States. We're going to reindustrialize the country. We're going to reindustrialize this and that. The Industrial Revolution's been over. The Industrial Revolution has been over for 75 years. There's no reindustrializing. We're not in the Industrial Age, because the Industrial Age is characterized by the invention of the steam engine. The steam engine, where the first time in human history, humanity had unlocked the power to do non-human and non-animal mechanical work that was scalable. You didn't need a water mill to be next to a river to do that form of work. You didn't need oxen to do this sort of stuff. This thing was entirely scalable and doesn't require human or animals to do it. And this unlocked the productive forces of humanity to do great and terrible things. The Industrial Revolution catapulted the capitalist mode of production into being. It is responsible for the modern world. It is responsible for the developmental differences between the first and the third world. Okay? And so the fun fact about the steam engine, and I'll go back to the science because I love talking about science, is that you cannot turn heat, pure heat, into work, because not all forms of energy are equal. Some energy has lower entropy and you can use it for work. In fact, every time you have to, the steam engine, you cannot build it, and this goes down to a fundamental rule, the second law of thermodynamics, you cannot turn pure heat into mechanical work. It unveils a level of contradictions that would basically unravel physics, and that's why, proof by contradiction shows that you can't do that, and you always need a colder body to use heat transfer to do mechanical work. And the funny part about the Industrial Revolution is that it really ended, you might ask, where did it end? It ended in your power plant, is because the last steam engines in use today are in your power plants today. And so every source of energy that is powering all your electronics, that allows you to hear my voice across YouTube, over the internet, that powers your computer, that powers my computer, that allows me to record this information that I speak in this microphone, is powered likely by one steam engine or another. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it is literally just a turbine that turns a generator, a motor that generates electricity. And these big turbines, a steam turbine, a steam engine, the last remaining steam engines into existence today are now in every power plant. Whether it be natural gas, whether it be coal, whether it be anything where you actually burn something, that heat is being used to power a steam engine. And that steam engine is connected to an electric motor, which then generates electric power to power everything around you virtually, okay? With the exception of certain power sources, with the exception of photovoltaic cells, which is a solid state technology that is much different. It is not fundamentally the same as the other power supplies, such as, you know, natural gas, coal, or even nuclear. Okay? Yeah, hell, you could even say with geothermal energy, that is once again a temperature difference that is being used to generate electrical energy, but it's being powered by geothermal vents. Okay? In one sort or another, the Industrial Revolution ended in your power plant. Those are where the remaining steam engines are that are now and today in existence. Nowhere else. That's where the Industrial Revolution ended. It ended in your power plant. With that being said, there's no magic to nuclear fission power. When people imagine nuclear fission power in the back of their head, they think they're of these glowing rocks that, you know, shoot these rays that, you know, just melt you away if you're just not careful with that. And to some degree, that is partially true. But it is overly hysterical, is because the fact is that nuclear fission power plants operate no differently than natural gas power plants, than coal power plants, and namely in the sense that all these things do is they boil water to turn a steam engine. That's all there is to it. There's no magic into a nuclear fission reactor other than the fact that, you know, these glowing rocks are used to boil water to turn a turbine. That's all there is, and that's essentially all a steam engine is. Okay? Now, one of the reasons why I'm such a big pro-nuclear fission shill is because per unit mass, 1 unit mass of uranium-235, and I don't even say you should use uranium-235, I'm more of a thorium-238 fan, and I believe in thorium nuclear fission reactors, is because the thing is, 1 unit mass, it could be a kilogram if you want to go by that measure, right? Per unit mass, you know, uranium-235 has about 10 million times more energy per unit mass than coal or gasoline, okay? And I use masses because that's a very interesting thing, is because you have to dig up significantly less uranium-235, thorium-238, or plutonium-239. I'm not advocating for plutonium-239 to actually use it to power some physical process, because that's how much more energy you get out of nuclear fission than you do get from, you know, doing chemical combustion. Okay, you know, from you know, whether it be gasoline, coal, which is just oxidizing, you put oxygen on it, and all that sorts of stuff. You know, that is significantly more power you get out of that than you get from coal or gasoline. Okay, and so just by looking at the numbers and looking at the physics, okay, you know, if every living material being has to exert some odd amount of energy, and you know, it is predicated on a ratio of how much energy they get back in return, that is significantly less energy one has to expend civilizationally to reproduce its own material existence to get so much energy back. Okay, so this whole idea that nuclear fission is just too expensive to do, I just don't get it, is because every ounce of empirical evidence suggests otherwise. Okay, you have France that has the cheapest electricity in Europe, and it is largely powered by nuclear fission power, yet they're tearing it down. You have Germany that tore down all their nuclear fission power in the 2010s. They went on a campaign for the last 10 years to do so, and they got rid of their last nuclear fission power plant in 2021. Okay? And they, instead of propping up green technologies like they said they would, they just propped up natural gas power plants. And then they entered in a proxy war with Russia, which was the primary supplier of their natural gas. And so, you know, when those sanctions hit in, they had one of the coldest winters in 2022 or 2022. Okay? Which was not a fun time for Germany. And so the thing is that we don't have very smart planning here. I've kind of already accepted that fact. You know, we definitely get the leaders that we deserve at the end of the day, whether we'd like to believe it or not. And I've been an outspoken proponent of nuclear fission power for quite some time as a solution to the climate crisis. Okay? And so just to give you an idea, if we were to basically, and here in the United States, because that's where I'm from, if we were to replace it, we have currently 98 nuclear fission power plants in existence. And that supplies about 20% of the energy to the United States at current demand. If we simply tore down and got rid of all the other power supply in the grid and, you know, just, you know, built 400 additional nuclear fission power plants. We had a total of 500 for the entire country. We'd be able to power the entire country at current demand and actually sustain our standard of living. Okay, and that was kind of the interesting thing about Hank Green's video when he started talking about how, you know, the Republicans are going to blame all these green energy sources for declining standard of living. And yes, the Democrats and the progressives do deserve this kind of slander to a large degree, because the fact is they wanted to basically, in the 2000s, that was the common talking point about, you know, neutering everybody's standard of living to save the environment. And that obviously didn't sit well with the vast majority of people, and for good reason. Okay, because the fact is, once again, the Democrats and the progressives are just as stupid as the Republicans, in my opinion, not recognizing that, A, people are not going to settle for a higher cost of living just to make sure that the polar bears don't drown when they can already swim, okay? Nobody's going to do that. People are going to secure their material existence first and foremost. Second of all, is they just don't think of the non-linearity of, you know, going to a less efficient power supply, a more garbage power supply, consequentially has civilizationally. Okay, I said that the Industrial Revolution forever transformed humanity and the way its civilization operates. Energy is the lifeblood not only for living material beings, but also civilization as well. And so to make something that is abundant and necessary, or something that is necessary for civilization more expensive, makes everything more expensive. Okay, we're not just talking about research and development. We're talking about other critical enterprises such as healthcare to keep people alive. And this is the thing that the Democrats don't realize, is because when they always talk about how they want to reduce, you know, energy usage instead of actually making things more efficient, you know, they just think that 100% of electrical energy use is just somehow going to just raw consumer goods, rather than recognizing that 80% of energy actually goes to critical infrastructure, you know, such as hospitals, research and development, and that when the standard of living gets worse and resources are less abundant, people do less things. And that's an unfortunate thing, is because if you want to actually do meaningful research towards nuclear fusion, I'm sorry, but you have to take advantage of the energy resources that you have today so you can make things efficient to actually pursue those goals. Because the fact is, advanced scientific research doesn't come out of a mud hut. Now, does it? Okay? With that being said, okay, as much as I am a pro-nuclear fission person, you know, the topic of the video is more or less to talk about why hydrogen cars never took off, okay? And so here's kind of an interesting thing, because I've actually had a bit of a change of heart. Even though I'm very pro-nuclear fission, I am pro-solar, but the thing is, the problem with solar and wind is that when you extract energy, where do you store it? Everybody has talked about battery arrays, but if I were to point out like the energy density of the average battery array in comparison to a fuel like gasoline or coal, okay, and say per unit mass and per unit volume, you know, how much energy can you stuff in this box? Batteries don't actually store a whole lot of energy in comparison to these other fuel cells. And I'll probably put that in a YouTube post so you can review it later, or maybe I'll just pop it up on screen when I actually do get it to you. But, you know, there's a lot more energy in coal and gasoline than it is in an electrical, you know, battery thing. And that's just an unfortunate fact of reality, is because battery cells are just not that great. You know, they've been getting better, and don't get me wrong, modern drone technology is practically in existence solely because of battery tech has advanced so much, and so have microcontrollers. But with that being said, you know, here's an interesting thing that you will never hear from anybody else, and this is the reason why I titled this video the way I did, why I chose this thing. And it was a bit clickbaity, and if you actually stuck around towards this section of the video, I actually want to open up that discussion about why hydrogen cars never took off. And so here's an interesting thing. That is a very good question, why hydrogen cars never took off, or hydrogen tech in general. Hydrogen cars are the big one, is because who doesn't like the idea of combusting hydrogen and oxygen to get energy? It's a really good idea. Now, let me tell you why, okay? And it has to do with logistics. There's a reason why hydrogen cars, even if you had perfectly working hydrogen combustion engines where you could burn hydrogen and oxygen to propel you, and those things do exist, and hydrogen fuel cells are becoming more efficient. They're actually really good. Toyota is doing a hydrogen-powered car. It's not that bad. It actually gets good mileage. It's a bit of a money sink, but it's not that bad. The problem has always been logistics with hydrogen-powered cars. And if you've always been curious on why hydrogen-powered cars have just never caught on, it goes to the simple fact that I can find a place to dig up oil. I can find a place to do fracking to get natural gas. Where do I get the hydrogen? And this is once again why I talk about thermodynamics so much. You might say, well, we can just get hydrogen from the ocean. Okay? Well, here's the thing. Let's go back to thermodynamics. I said energy cannot be created nor can be destroyed. And on top of that, okay, you also have to bear in mind that not all energy sources are the same. Okay? You know, if you were to, you might say, why don't you just separate hydrogen and oxygen to actually do this? Okay, cool. Let's take water and separate hydrogen and oxygen. How do you do that? Well, that requires energy, okay? Where's that energy going to come from? Okay, we talked about, this is kind of the thing because nobody's really talked about this for a while now. Okay, where's that energy going to come from? Where you're going to separate hydrogen and oxygen? You got to get it from somewhere because that's just how thermodynamics work. You have to put in just as much energy, if not more, to undo that bond of H2O to separate hydrogen and oxygen from a water molecule. And don't get me wrong, it's possible, but you have to get the energy somewhere, right? Okay, I talked about that every living material being needs to reproduce its existence by expending a certain amount of energy to get a certain amount of energy back, whenever it works, okay? You have to do this through physical labor to obtain the food you eat, to get that 2,000 calories a day to reproduce your material existence. Now, obviously, that energy you expend, the 2,000 calories, has to always be less than the food that you obtain when you work for it, okay? Okay, so here's the thing. Unfortunately, because what you're trying to do is undo a chemical reaction, you have to put in more energy. There's not really any hydrogen reserves you can think of that you could just dig right out of the ground with hydrogen gas ready to combust with the air. It's because the thing is, I can dig coal out of the ground, okay? And I can combust that with the oxygen in the atmosphere, and I can get free energy out of that, okay? And I can take natural gas, and I can take a lighter, and I can set that on fire, and I can release energy from that. But, you can't just light water on fire. You need to get the energy from somewhere. And so, it costs more energy to separate that. So it's not that you're extracting energy from burning hydrogen and oxygen, okay? This is where I'm going to open up the discussion, and you're going to get your mind blown. You might appreciate this video, you might not. It really depends on you at the end of the day, okay? The thing is, hydrogen is not a great fuel source. You're not going to dig it up the ground. You're not going to create giant oil supply chain equivalents with hydrogen, because that's not how that works, okay? Because of this fact that it requires energy to actually pull it, to actually separate it, to turn it into a fuel cell, it's actually better as a storage system, okay? Because I could pull up I'm going to go ahead and put it on the screens because I don't know it off the top of my head, but I could probably get the numbers for you on how much energy you can get by basically combusting hydrogen and oxygen, okay? That's something you could probably figure out on your own. You could compare that to how much energy you could extract just raw heat from gasoline or coal, or maybe even nuclear fission materials, and do that comparison on yourself, right? I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. If I do put them on, it's going to be after the fact I edit the video, when I'm done recording, and I go look up the numbers myself because I don't remember it off the top of my head, right? And so here's kind of the thing. You need that much energy to separate it, but you can separate it somehow. Okay, now that you can't dig it out of the ground like coal or oil and just light it on fire, because that's how coal and oil work, okay? There's not an energy surplus you're extracting out there. It's not an exploitation of free energy provided by nature. You've got to get the energy somewhere else. That is why there are no hydrogen cars. Hydrogen cars don't exist is because the fact is, until relatively recently, it's not very easy to make hydrogen fuel chains, supply chains, okay? Because the fact is, you don't just dig it out with like an oil derrick and you process it a little bit, which is always less energy, because the fact is, this is something you could just light on fire and get free energy from burning in the air, like natural gas or oil, okay? You can do that, but you can't do that with hydrogen. You have to supply more energy than what you get out of the ground. So you could take water, okay? So here's kind of the interesting thing. That is why there has not been a mass adoption of hydrogen-powered equipment. And hydrogen cars are just one thing, but I mean hydrogen-powered equipment, okay? Now that you know that fact, okay, why there are no hydrogen supply lines, no hydrogen logistical, supply chains like there is for oil or natural gas, is because the fact is you already have an expended energy source. You need energy to basically separate hydrogen and oxygen, and you could use it ad infinitum. And this is where it's going to be quite exciting. This is why I say I'm more pro-solar now, hypothetically, is because we still don't have the technology for this sort of stuff, is because that is one thing you can use to actually store energy from solar and wind. Believe it or not, okay? You can use solar and wind to separate hydrogen and oxygen from water. It's actually really easy, okay? What I want you to do is I want you to go to the nearest, Ace Hardware, you can call Home Depot, Lowe's, go buy yourself a solar panel. It usually outputs, I believe, 10.8 volts, DC, okay? I want you to grab a cup of water, and I want you to put a little bit of salt in it. Now, I don't remember which, anode or cathode is going to create the hydrogen ions, but it's usually attracted to the other, right? And so what will happen is when you put the positive and the negative line and your saline solution is effectively, and you hook up your solar panel, that you take it outside, you put it directly towards the sun, you take the lines, you put it in the salt water, you're going to notice a bunch of bubbles coming off the negative terminal, okay? Those are hydrogen. That's hydrogen gas. If you want to put that in a balloon and then light it on fire, do it. It's a fuel source. There you go. But the reason you can do that is because that energy came from the sun. Okay, it first came off as a photon that was being done by nuclear fusion in the core of the sun. It took 5 minutes to actually transport to the Earth and then hit your solar panel. And then when the solar panel hit it, it excited some electrons in its solid state, p-n junction. Okay, and those free electrons went to the terminals that you have on the output of your solar panel, okay? And that was what separated, through a process known as electrolysis, the ions in your solution. Now, don't smell the gas coming out of the positive terminal, because I'm pretty sure that's chlorine gas, especially if you use a salt solution. But there you go. You've just created hydrogen. It's actually really easy. But the thing is, the reason why there are no hydrogen supply lines or supply chains is because the fact is you required gathering energy someplace else as opposed to using it as a fuel source directly. You can't use water as a fuel source by itself because it's an already expended form of energy. In fact, when you burn oxygen and hydrogen together, you're expending that energy in burning it. Okay, so it's not a readily available resource that you can just dig out of the ground like natural gas or coal or, nuclear fission, with uranium-235, and you just shoot neutrons in it and then it splits. Okay. Hydrogen, you had to actually separate that chemically to actually create that fuel to be usable for anything else, okay? And that's why hydrogen cars and hydrogen tools haven't taken off. But here's kind of an interesting point I want to make at this video, because the fact is everyone is so busy talking about batteries and solar, okay? For the longest time, I have not been the biggest fan of solars because it's all, and wind as well, is because where do you store that energy? If you have been listening throughout this entire video, it's probably already clicking to you. Hydrogen fuel cells. It's really simple, okay? Because the thing is, same with wind and same with solar, is now you have a place where you can store the energy. You can store that energy in hydrogen tanks by separating water into hydrogen and oxygen. And now you can create entirely green, hydrogen supply chains just based on solar. Heck, if you wanted to abandon nuclear fission power for this process, well, there you had it. There you go. You don't need to talk about nuclear fission anymore. Just keep upgrading solar, and then we'll just create an entire hydrogen supply chain, and then, we're done. Okay, everything that previously used any other form of combustion, whether it be gasoline combustion or something else, now you can use hydrogen. Now, hydrogen fuel cells, it's a bit disingenuous. I don't know how hydrogen combustion engines work. I've just always wondered about how you actually procure the fuels to actually power civilization to do that, okay? So everybody is talking about using batteries to store electrical energy from solar and wind. Why don't we just use hydrogen? Because then we can use that in hydrogen fuel cells, and it looks like that's already a mature technology to some degree that can be used. And then there you go. You have an entire ecosystem of technology that uses hydrogen to power all of civilization, and not an ounce of carbon dioxide comes out of that. Well, I'm going to be honest with you. One of the reasons why I'm not big solid state technology, wise, and this is one of the things that you probably heard many people making this talking point against solar panels, is that it's very materially disgusting. You use a lot of toxic chemicals to create solar panels. Well, okay, here's kind of the thing, okay? You use a ton of arsenic in IC manufacturing and manufacturing solid state technology. It's just an unfortunate part of the process of fabricating ICs or integrated circuits, or the thing is, the people complaining about solar panels and photovoltaic cells being an incredibly lethal process using a bunch of fancy materials, it's no different than what it takes to manufacture RAMs and CPUs. Okay, if you really want to have that contention, you could have that contention about solar and wind, but there you go. Now you know why hydrogen cars have never taken off, and on top of that, why that they might take off in the near future is because now we have an energy source that is green that we can use to separate hydrogen and oxygen and create entire fuel chains and supply chains for hydrogen fuel cells. Okay, now it's all possible, and this would all be done very efficiently, because solar, to credit where credit's due, after watching Hank Green's video, solar is incredibly cheap. There's no reason not to use it if you can actually store that energy, so the perfect opportunity is hydrogen fuel tanks. Now, of course, some people are going to complain about hydrogen fuel tanks being dangerous and they could explode, but there's always a pedestrian midwit. I hate to break it to you, if you're going to complain about energy being dangerous, you're probably an absolute idiot, is because did you also know that your gasoline fuel tank can explode? Did you also know the battery in your phone can also explode? It's because free extraneous energy has always been dangerous. It starts fires. Shocker, reality. But again, that goes back to my original point at the beginning of this video, is that if I had the choice to force everybody to take one class before they're allowed to have an opinion about energy policy, it would just be thermodynamics, nothing else. You don't need calculus to understand the first and second laws. You might need it for the more advanced calculations, going about like adiabatic processes and, understanding how to create the Carnot cycle. But to be fair, you probably really don't. That's just my 2 cents. You know, you could talk about these things without having to go into the details, and you could understand these things at least conceptually, especially the first and second laws of thermodynamics. But now that I have made my point on why that is the case, why, you know, I still support nuclear fission power, but, you know, I want to open up the discussion to you guys, because the fact is I like to open up an interesting discussion with my own audience every time I make a video and say, what do you think is the future? Do you think that we're going to go through with nuclear fission? I mean, I'm going to be honest, the United States is toast. I don't really have much hope in the United States because we're ruled by idiots. And on top of that, they don't really care about truth. They don't really care about talking about better ideas or what's better. They're more interested in having discussions. They're more concerned about optics and how things look than what things actually are. And so, you know, everything I say is purely in the hypothetical, and every discussion that I have is really with my own people, because I don't really expect, like, you know, the people in the halls of power to actually listen to this, even if it was in their interest. Do you think that we're going to stick with nuclear? Do you think we're going to go through with nuclear fission power, or do you think that, you know, we're going to go through with solar and wind? China seems to be a big proponent of solar. I'm going to be honest with you, and I've talked about China a lot on this channel, okay, because I admire their engineering, but this is something that even they don't talk about. They don't talk about hydrogen fuel lines. They don't talk about hydrogen supply lanes and using solar to do that. They're probably in a better position than the United States is, and I would argue that, like, you know, I'm still pro-nuclear fission, but what direction do you think we should go? Okay, you know, are you more pro-solar panel and hydrogen supply lines, or are you more nuclear fission powers? Because I don't think either way is, you know, wrong. It's just the thing is it takes time for the right people to actually understand this reality about how physics works. With that being said, I'm going to close off the video. I think I've made my point. If you enjoyed what's talked about in this video, don't forget to drop a like, share the video, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy the content. You know, I love to hear the discussion and see what you guys type in the comments every time I open up a roundtable discussion to you guys about these ideas. But that's just food for thought. That's just my 2 cents. And so I want to know what your 2 cents is. Drop a comment and tell me what you think. What do you think is the best route to actually make energy cheaper? Because Hank Green seems to be, you know, pretty doom-pilled. I feel bad for him. I would love to open the discussion about it. It was like how technologically we can make civilization better. With that being said, you guys have a good day. Peace, peace.